I was 17 when I first saw the spores fall. They came during the autumn harvest, when the valley fields turned golden and the air smelled of turned earth and ripening grain. I was working the northwestern perimeter of my family's agricultural tract, checking irrigation systems, when I noticed the sky had changed. Not darkened, changed. A green-tinged haze had formed along the upper atmosphere, visible even through the daylight. Beautiful, almost. Like an aurora that had no business existing on a garden world with stable magnetospheric activity. My name was Matthias Kellen. I note this because names stop mattering soon in this testimony. I was the second son of a grain cultivation family on Verdalis Prime, a world the administratum had classified as paradise grade for 3 centuries. Our classification was not metaphorical. The orbital surveys measured our atmospheric composition at optimal human tolerance. Our fauna exhibited 0 apex predators. Our flora required minimal gene tailoring. The average citizen lived 87 standard years. Children played outdoors without supervision. The concept of a fortified settlement was academic, discussed only in history texts about the age of strife. We were soft. Deliberately, systematically soft. That was the point of paradise worlds. They existed as proof that the Imperium could create safety, could carve out pockets of genuine peace in a galaxy that devoured hope. They were propaganda made geography. We knew this, even celebrated it. Better to be useful propaganda than another hive world grinding its population into nutrient paste. The spores fell for 3 days. They drifted down like snow. Except snow was a phenomenon I had only seen in Picts. Each spore measured perhaps 2 centimeters across, fungal structures that left faint green residue when they contacted skin. The Planetary Governor's Office issued statements. They identified the phenomenon as xenobiological contamination, likely debris from a passing Orc exit coordinates. The contamination was minimal. The spores were dead matter. Cleanup crews would handle atmospheric scrubbing. Citizens should remain calm and report any unusual biological activity to local administratum offices. I collected samples that first week. This was not initiative. This was training. Verdalis educational protocols emphasize xenobiology because paradise worlds needed to understand what could threaten their status. I sealed 17 spores in specimen containers and delivered them to the district biologist station. The tech adept logged my delivery and told me they had received 4,000 similar samples in the past 6 days. Analysis was pending. I should return to standard activities. The first fungal blooms appeared 11 days after initial spore fall. They emerged in the places water collected, drainage ditches, irrigation channels, the edges of our ornamental lakes. Green-gray growths, fibrous and dense, expanding at rates that violated every growth model in our agricultural databases. I measured one bloom cluster near our eastern water distribution node. On day 1 of observation, it measured 43 centimeters in diameter. On day 2, 1 meter 12 centimeters. On day 3, 3 meters 8 centimeters. The growth was not linear. It was exponential. My father contacted the district biologist station. They confirmed similar growth patterns across 17,000 registered sites. Herbicide applications showed 0 effectiveness. Mechanical removal protocols were being drafted. Teams would be dispatched as personnel allowed. Current estimated response time, 4 to 6 weeks. He should monitor the growth and maintain detailed records. We burned the first clusters ourselves. My father, my elder brother Davos, and I spent 2 days with plasma torches, incinerating every fungal mass within our property boundaries. The burns were effective. The fungal matter combusted at surprisingly low temperatures, leaving blackened circles of sterilized soil. We documented the process, transmitted our findings to the biologist station, and felt competent. We had acted. We had solved a local manifestation of a larger problem while waiting for official response. The fungus returned in the burned zones within 72 hours. Not regrowth, new emergence. The spores had penetrated deeper than surface contamination. They had entered the soil structure itself, the water table, perhaps the bedrock. Burning surface growth was cutting visible weeds, while roots remained untouched. I was present when my father made the second call to the biologist station. I stood in our communication room, listening to him describe the regrowth pattern, the acceleration, the spread beyond our property into the communal agricultural zones. The tech adept's voice came through the vox with a quality I had never heard in administratum communications before. Exhaustion. They were aware. Growth sites now numbered over 2 million across the primary continent. Orbital surveyor data indicated similar patterns on continents 2 through 7. The governor's office had escalated the situation to subsector command. Imperial assistance had been formally requested. Estimated response time, 6 to 18 months, depending on available naval assets. 6 to 18 months. I remember calculating what exponential growth meant across that time frame. I remember my father's face as he performed the same calculation. I remember neither of us speaking the conclusion aloud. The first orc emerged 47 days after initial spore fall, not on our property, 17 kilometers northeast, in what had been a nature preservation zone. A single specimen, approximately 1 meter tall, malformed and weak, but alive, unquestionably alive. The local security forces killed it with conventional stub weapons and incinerated the corpse. The biologist station performed a full genetic workup on tissue samples. The conclusion: viable orc biology, immature specimen, genetic markers indicating spawning from fungal reproduction rather than natural birth. Natural birth. The term made no sense in xenobiological context, yet the report used it anyway. Because the alternative, the truth that orcs did not require conventional reproduction, that they emerged from their own dead matter, from spores that could lie dormant and then colonize entire biospheres, was a horror that required precise language to contain. 47 specimens emerged in the following week, then 412. Then numbers the authorities stopped publishing. They appeared in clusters near the largest fungal masses, which we now understood were not merely contamination but cultivation zones, growing mediums, biological factories producing warrior organisms from ambient nutrients and water. The paradise world that had fed us for 3 centuries was now feeding them. The governor declared a state of emergency. Mandatory relocation protocols were enacted. All citizens were to evacuate rural zones and consolidate into the primary urban centers where defensive perimeters could be established. We had 96 hours to comply. I remember packing. Not the specific items, those blur in memory, but the sensation of selecting what defined a life from everything a life had accumulated. My mother chose family picts and my grandmother's prayer beads. My father chose tools and seed samples, still believing we would return, would replant, would restore what was being abandoned. Davos chose weapons, practical in his assessment as always. I chose books and specimen containers, still thinking like a student, still believing documentation mattered. We joined the convoys on the 43rd day of consolidation. 17,000 families moving along transit routes designed for leisurely travel, now choked with vehicles, cargo haulers, livestock transports. I sat in the back of our family transport and watched our valley disappear behind us. The fields I had worked were already showing green-gray discoloration where fungal growth had infiltrated the grain. The irrigation systems that had sustained 7 generations of cultivation now spread contamination with mechanical efficiency. Paradise was being overwritten, rewritten, transformed into something that served different purposes. The urban consolidation zone, they did not call it a refugee camp, though that is what it was, occupied what had been Verdalis Prime's capital city's industrial district. Population capacity, 80,000. Current population, 460,000 and climbing. I learned to measure space in centimeters per person. I learned the smell of human density, sweat and waste and fear combined into an atmospheric signature that no scrubbing system could fully process. I volunteered for perimeter observation duty. This was not courage. This was necessity. The consolidation zone required constant intelligence on enemy growth patterns. emergence rates, movement behaviors. The Planetary Defense Forces, 12,000 troops trained primarily for ceremonial duties and disaster response, needed everybody capable of holding surveyor equipment. I qualified. I reported to the Southeastern Observation Post and received my assignment. My commander was a lieutenant named Harrow, a career PDF officer who had spent 32 years preparing for threats that never materialized. He was 51 years old, trained in tactics he had never employed, and now responsible for monitoring an invasion he had no framework to comprehend. He did not pretend otherwise. On my first day, he showed me the observation protocols, the reporting procedures, the enemy identification guides that had been transmitted from Subsector Command. Then he said very quietly, "We are watching a world die. Document everything. Someone should remember what this looked like." I became a witness. That is the only term that encompasses the function. I sat in observation posts and recorded what the Orc ecosystem did to a paradise world when given time to establish itself. Week 7. Fungal coverage reached 43% of primary continent landmass. Orc emergence sites numbered over 12,000. Specimen sizes ranged from juvenile forms at 1 meter to mature warriors at 2 meters plus. Tool use observed. Primitive weapons, clubs, blades, projectile throwers being manufactured from scavenged materials. Week 9. First organized mob activity. Groups of 30 to 50 orcs moving with apparent coordination, raiding abandoned settlements for metal, technology, anything that could be repurposed. They were learning, not intelligently in human terms, but instinctively, genetically programmed to escalate from emergence to organization to warfare. Week 12. Fungal masses began exhibiting structural differentiation. Some zones produced warrior forms. Others produced smaller subspecies, maintenance organisms perhaps, or specialized support breeds. The ecosystem was not random. It was developing complexity, creating a complete biosphere that served singular purpose, producing more orcs to fight more wars. Week 14. First human casualties from direct orc contact. A perimeter patrol engaged a mob looting an abandoned agricultural depot. 8 PDF troopers with lasguns against 43 orcs with improvised weapons. The orcs lost 37 specimens. The PDF lost 6 troopers. The mathematics were clear and damning. We could win individual engagements. We could not win the war of attrition. Every orc we killed fed the fungal cycle. Every dead orc became spores that produced more orcs. We were not fighting an enemy. We were fighting a reproductive cycle that weaponized its own casualties. I met Corporal Shen during week 16. He was assigned to my observation post after the previous team rotation suffered casualties from a collapse in their position. He was 23, thin, with hands that trembled when he thought no one was watching. He had been a botanist before the consolidation, studying Vidalis Prime's native flora for pharmaceutical applications. Now he studied fungal growth patterns and counted orc emergence rates. We did not become friends immediately. Friendship requires leisure, requires safety, requires the assumption of continuity. We had none of these. But we worked adjacent to each other for 12-hour shifts, day after day, and eventually proximity became familiarity. He told me about the research he had been conducting, about a flowering vine that produced compounds with remarkable analgesic properties. He had been 3 months from publication when the spores fell. His life's work was now overrun by fungal contamination. His research facility abandoned, his specimens dead or transformed into breeding grounds for Xenos organisms. I told him about the valley, about the fields, about the specific quality of light during autumn harvest when the sun hit the grain at angles that made everything seem golden and permanent. I had not spoken these details to anyone. Speaking them made them archive rather than memory, moved them from living experience to testimony. Shen understood this. He listened without platitudes, without reassurance that we would someday return. He knew the truth. We both knew. We were not observing a temporary crisis. We were witnessing an extinction event. documenting the death of a world in real time. Week 19, Orc mobs began probing the consolidation zone perimeters, not full assaults, testing actions, measuring response times, learning defense patterns. They were intelligent enough for tactics. This was new information. This was terrifying information. Command issued revised engagement protocols. All contact was to be avoided unless absolutely necessary. Conservation of ammunition took priority. Imperial relief forces were still months away. Week 22, a mob breached the northwestern perimeter. 47 orcs with crude firearms and bladed weapons. The PDF responded with concentrated lasgun fire and improvised explosives. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. All orc specimens were neutralized. 19 PDF troopers died. 31 civilians died in the crossfire or the panic that followed. I helped process the bodies afterward, logged their identities, sealed them in temporary morgue facilities that were already exceeding capacity. The math continued. We were winning engagements and losing the war. Shen stopped trembling around week 24. I noted this change. His hand steadied, his voice flattened. He processed observation data with mechanical efficiency, no longer pausing over particularly disturbing measurements. He was adapting. We all were. The human mind cannot maintain crisis response indefinitely. Eventually, horror becomes baseline. Extinction becomes weather, something to note and work around. I asked him once if he still thought about his research. He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched him calculate whether honesty or comfort was more appropriate. He chose honesty. I think about the vine sometimes, but it's like remembering someone else's dream, that person who cared about pharmaceutical applications. He died when the spores fell. I'm what's left. A witness who used to be a botanist. Week 209. Fungal coverage exceeded 70% of total planetary landmass. Orc population estimates, and they were estimates, precise counting had become impossible, ranged between 800,000 and 1.2 million specimens. They had established what orbital reconnaissance identified as a central settlement, a sprawling complex of scrap metal structures and fungal cultivation zones covering approximately 40 square kilometers. The translation from High Gothic military terminology was imprecise, but command used the orc word anyway. A wag was forming. Week 30, 1 second perimeter breach, eastern sector. This assault was coordinated. 3 separate mob groups attacking in sequence, drawing defensive fire, learning our ammunition capacity. We held. Barely. The casualty reports were distributed without public announcement. 407 PDF, 293 civilian. The consolidation zone population had dropped below 300,000. Not from evacuation. There was nowhere to evacuate to. From attrition. From disease outbreaks in the overcrowded districts. From despair translated into action via blades or chemicals or simply stopped hearts. My father died during week 33. Not from orcs. From a pulmonary infection that spread through the southern residential district, where families with agricultural backgrounds had been concentrated. The medical facilities were overwhelmed, antibiotics rationed. His infection was classified as non-priority. He lasted 6 days. I was not present when he died. I was on duty, observing orc movement patterns 17 kilometers from the perimeter. They transmitted the notification via Vox. I logged the timestamp. 0847 hours, day 231 post-contamination. I continued my shift. There was no protocol for grief. There was only continuation. Shen found me during the break period. He said nothing, simply sat beside me in the observation post and remained present. Presence was the only gift that mattered anymore. Words were insufficient. Comfort was impossible. But proximity, the knowledge that isolation was not mandatory even when isolation was earned, that sustained. I think that was when Shen stopped being a colleague and became something more, the person whose absence would create a hole rather than an empty space. I did not acknowledge this at the time. Acknowledgement created vulnerability, and vulnerability was dangerous when everything was temporary, when everyone was dying just at different speeds. Week 37. The PDF command structure began to fragment, not from cowardice, from mathematics. Lieutenant Harrow gathered his observation teams and presented the reality without embellishment. Current Orc population estimates 2 million plus. Current defensive force capability 4,000 combat-effective troops. Ammunition supplies projected to last 6 to 8 weeks at current engagement rates. Imperial relief forces still no confirmed arrival date. Subsector Command had acknowledged our situation and classified Vidalis Prime as contested territory pending resource allocation. Contested territory. The euphemism was precise and damning. We had been downgraded from crisis requiring immediate intervention to acceptable loss awaiting paperwork. Harrow did not editorialize. He simply presented the data and asked for volunteers to maintain observation posts. Everyone volunteered. Not from loyalty or courage, but because observation duty meant purpose, and purpose was the only medication that still worked. The Orc ecosystem continued its transformation unimpeded. I documented changes that suggested terrifying sophistication. The fungal masses were no longer random growth patterns. They formed networks connecting emergent sites to the central WAG settlement through what appeared to be nutrient distribution channels. The Orcs were not simply spawning randomly. They were being produced with intention, with resource allocation, with something that resembled agricultural planning. Shen and I discussed this during Night Watch on day 267. The consolidation zone had implemented blackout protocols, reducing power consumption to critical systems only. The observation posts operated on minimal lighting, enough to read instruments, but not enough to compromise night vision. We sat in near darkness, monitoring thermal signatures and movement sensors, and Shen said, "It's more efficient than we were." I asked him to elaborate. He gestured at the surveyor data, the mapped fungal networks, the calculated Orc emergence rates. We took 3 centuries to develop sustainable agriculture on this world. Soil conditioning, irrigation networks, crop rotation, genetic optimization, 3 centuries of human effort to achieve stability. They did it in 9 months. They took our world and made it more productive than we ever managed. It just produces them instead of us. The observation was accurate. It was also the moment I understood we were not fighting an invasion. We were being replaced. The Orc ecosystem was not destroying Vidalis Prime. It was upgrading it, transforming paradise engineered for human comfort into paradise engineered for eternal warfare. The world would remain beautiful in its own terms. Green, growing, thriving, simply serving different masters. Week 41. My mother died. Malnutrition complications. The ration systems had collapsed 2 weeks prior when a supply depot was overrun. She had been giving portions of her allocation to children in her residential block. I learned this after, from a woman who had tried to stop her, who had told her that individual sacrifice was meaningless against systemic shortage. My mother had responded that meaningless sacrifice was the only kind that remained pure. I did not attend her body's processing. I was on duty. I logged the death notification and continued observation protocols. Shen held my hand that night. Not romantically. There was nothing romantic in our existence, but his fingers wrapped around mine in the darkness of the observation post, and the pressure was acknowledgement. We were dying. Everyone we had known was dying. The world itself was dying, but in that moment we were not alone. The distinction mattered. It was all that mattered. Week 46, Davos took his own life. I received no notification. No explanation. I found him during a perimeter inspection in a storage facility, a single lasgun wound to the head. He had positioned himself carefully to avoid damaging equipment, had left his weapon cleaned and ready for redistribution. Even in death, my brother maintained efficiency. I reported the discovery. I processed the scene. I logged the casualty. I did not break. Breaking was a luxury requiring the assumption that wholeness was still achievable. Shen found me 2 hours later. I was sitting in our observation post, staring at instruments I was no longer reading. He entered quietly, assessed my state with the practiced evaluation of someone who had witnessed too many collapses, and said, "Tell me about the valley." I told him. Not the sanitized version I had offered before, the complete testimony. The specific angle of morning light through my bedroom window. The sound my father made when he laughed, rare but genuine. The way my mother sang while preparing meals, old songs in dialects that predated Imperial Gothic standardization. The texture of grain stalks under my hands during harvest, the smell of rain on soil that had never known industrial contamination, the precise shade of blue the sky turned during summer afternoons. I spoke for perhaps an hour. Shen listened without interruption, without commentary, simply bearing witness to my witness. When I finished, he said, "I'm glad that existed. I'm glad you remember." "It doesn't matter," I said. "Remembering doesn't change anything." "No," he agreed. "But it confirms something was here before them, that we were real, not just the gap between orc worlds." The consolidation zone population had declined to 147,000. The PDF numbered fewer than 2,000 combat-capable troops. Ammunition reserves were critical. Food supplies were catastrophic. The governor, who had maintained administrative pretense throughout the crisis, finally acknowledged what we had known for months. Verdalis Prime was lost. Survival was now measured in weeks, perhaps days. He transmitted a final plea to Subsector Command, then sealed himself in his residence. We found him dead 3 days later. Poison, self-administered. A final exercise of control over the uncontrollable. Lieutenant Harrow assumed command by default. There was no formal transfer of authority, no ceremony. He simply began issuing orders, and we followed them because orders implied structure, and structure was the last barrier against complete dissolution. He implemented what he called continuation protocols. Reduced perimeter defense, concentrated forces around critical infrastructure, acceptance that large portions of the consolidation zone were now indefensible. The orcs did not immediately exploit our weakness. This was perhaps the most disturbing development. They had grown beyond simple aggression. Their probing attacks ceased. They withdrew to their central settlement and the surrounding cultivation zones. Orbital reconnaissance showed massive construction activity, resource gathering, what appeared to be preparation for something larger than exterminating the remaining human presence. Shen interpreted the data, and his conclusion was grim. "They don't need to kill us anymore. We're irrelevant. They're building for the next stage. Ships, probably. Weapons. They're going to leave, spread to other worlds. We were just the seed world. Now we're the factory." Week 59, I was assigned to a reconnaissance team tasked with gathering intelligence on the central orc settlement. This was not standard observation duty. This was penetration of enemy territory, close-range documentation of their technological capabilities, assessment of their war-making potential. The mission parameters were explicit: intelligence gathering only, no engagement, no heroics. 6 volunteers, 3-day operations, survival probability classified as minimal. Shen was not assigned to the team, he volunteered anyway. Harrow initially refused. Shen's analytical skills were too valuable to risk, but Shen insisted with an intensity I had never heard from him. He needed to see. He needed to witness directly what his botanical expertise told him was impossible and inevitable. Harrow relented. Perhaps he understood that denying purpose was crueler than permitting danger. We departed at 0400 hours on day 413. 6 of us, myself, Shen, 2 PDF troopers named Voss and Kelm, a tech adept called Moravec, and a former Hiveganger named Jace who possessed navigation skills from a past he never discussed. We moved through the ruins of what had been Verdalis Prime's secondary agricultural zones, through fields now completely consumed by fungal growth, through settlements that had become orc spawning grounds. The smell was overwhelming. Not rot, growth. Aggressive, accelerated biological processes producing organisms at rates that violated thermodynamic efficiency. The air tasted green, if green had flavor. Spores drifted constantly, thick enough to require respirator equipment. The fungal masses pulsed with internal movement, producing sounds like slow breathing, like the world itself had developed lungs. We observed our first orc emergence on day 2. A fungal mass approximately 4 meters in diameter, split open with a wet tearing sound. The orc that extracted itself was fully formed, nearly 2 meters tall, immediately mobile. It stood, oriented itself, and walked directly toward the central settlement without hesitation or confusion. It knew its purpose from the moment of emergence. It required no training, no conditioning. The genetic programming was complete. Shen recorded the entire sequence with shaking hands. Not fear. Scientific fascination at witnessing something that should not exist, but did. He whispered observations into his recording device about growth rates, resource efficiency, biological impossibility made manifest. Then he looked at me and said, "We never had a chance. Nothing could have stopped this." We reached visual range of the central settlement on day 3. The scope of what the orcs had constructed defied comprehension. Towers of scrap metal and fungal matter rising hundreds of meters, weapons emplacements that dwarfed anything in the PDF arsenal, manufacturing facilities producing crude but functional vehicles, aircraft, artillery pieces, and orcs, millions of them, moving with coordinated purpose through a city they had built in less than a year on a world they had taken without firing a shot during invasion. Moravec recorded technical specifications. Voss and Kelm mapped defensive positions. Jace calculated potential approach routes for orbital bombardment, though we all knew no bombardment was coming. I documented the scale, trying to translate what I witnessed into language that would convey the totality of our replacement. Shen focused on the fungal networks. He traced the cultivation zones, the nutrient distribution systems, the emergence sites organized by apparent specialization. He was crying while he worked. Not sobbing, silent tears running down his face while his hands maintained steady documentation. He was watching the death of everything he had studied, everything he had valued. Verdalis Prime's ecosystem, delicate, balanced, 3 billion years of evolution, had been overwritten in 14 months by a biological weapons system that treated worlds as disposable resources. We began our extraction on day 3, hour 17. The mission was complete. We had documented everything command required. Survival now depended on speed and fortune. We had neither. The Orc Patrol found us 6 kilometers from the settlement perimeter. 17 orcs with firearms, closing from multiple angles. Jace identified an escape route through a collapsed infrastructure tunnel. We ran. The orcs pursued with enthusiasm that suggested sport rather than threat assessment. They were hunting us for entertainment. Voss died first. A projectile round caught him in the spine, dropping him instantly. We could not stop. We could not retrieve him. We heard him screaming behind us for perhaps 30 seconds before the sounds changed into something else, something I will not detail here. Kelm died at the tunnel entrance, providing covering fire while the rest of us entered. He killed 3 orcs before they overwhelmed his position. We sealed the tunnel access behind us and ran through darkness that smelled of stagnant water and fungal growth. The tunnel system was older than the colony, part of the original terraforming infrastructure. The orcs had not yet penetrated this deep. We had perhaps an hour before they excavated the entrance or found alternative access points. We moved as quickly as darkness and unfamiliar terrain allowed. Moravec died when the tunnel floor collapsed beneath him. Ancient construction failing under stress, he fell 7 meters into a flooded subsection. The impact or the water killed him. We never determined which. We heard the splash, the brief struggle, then silence. 3 of us remained. Myself, Shen, and Jace. We emerged from the tunnel system 16 hours later, dehydrated and exhausted but alive. The consolidation zone perimeter was 9 kilometers distant. We could see it across the transformed landscape, a small concentration of light surrounded by endless green-gray fungal masses. Jace calculated our approach route. We would move during darkness, minimize exposure, reach the perimeter by dawn. Standard infiltration protocols. We rested for 2 hours, consuming our remaining water and ration packs, preparing for the final push. Shen sat beside me during that rest period. We did not speak initially. Speaking required energy we needed for movement. But eventually he said very quietly, "I'm glad I came. I needed to see it. I needed to understand completely." "Understand what?" I asked. "That we were never the point. This world, our civilization, 3 centuries of human presence, we were just the medium. The canvas. They're the art. We were temporary. They're eternal. Every death just makes more of them. Every defeat feeds their victory. We built paradise, and it became their garden." He was correct. The observation was analytically sound. It was also the moment I realized Shen had moved beyond processing and into acceptance. Not surrender, acceptance. The distinction is crucial. Surrender implies opposition. Acceptance is the recognition that opposition was always theatrical. We began our final approach at 0300 hours. 9 kilometers through hostile territory. We moved slowly, carefully, using terrain features and darkness for concealment. The fungal masses were quiescent during night hours, their metabolic processes apparently slowing without solar input. The orcs were visible in the distance, torchlights and fire pits marking their positions. They did not patrol aggressively. They did not need to. The world was already theirs. We covered 7 kilometers without incident. I allowed myself to calculate survival probability. Foolish. Dangerous. Hope is corrosive when applied to impossible situations. The orc appeared from a fungal mass we were circumnavigating. A lone specimen, perhaps separated from its mob, perhaps on independent patrol. 2 meters tall, armed with a crude blade, surprised to encounter us. The surprise was mutual. Jace responded first, firing his lasgun in a single controlled burst. The orc died. The noise was catastrophic. In the silence of pre-dawn, the lasgun discharge carried for kilometers. We heard responses immediately. Orc calls in that brutal language, movement in multiple directions, the stirring of a nest we had just kicked. "Run," Jace said. Unnecessary instruction. We were already moving. The perimeter was 2 kilometers distant. We covered the first kilometer in approximately 8 minutes, faster than tactical movement allowed but slower than panic dictated. The orcs were behind us, their calls growing louder, more numerous. They were converging, organizing, responding with coordination that confirmed their evolution beyond simple aggression. Shen stumbled at the 1 kilometer mark. Not fell. Stumbled. His respirator had failed, clogged with spore accumulation, and he was breathing unfiltered air thick with contamination. He recovered, kept moving, but his pace had declined. Jace and I slowed to match him. We did not discuss this. We simply adjusted. Leaving him was unthinkable. Not from morality, from necessity. He was the last person whose absence would matter. The perimeter defense forces saw us at 500 meters. They illuminated our approach with searchlights and demanded identification. Jace transmitted our codes while we ran. The gates began opening. 400 meters. 300. The orc projectile hit Shen at 230 meters. I heard the impact before I understood what had occurred. A wet sound, meat accepting metal. Shen fell forward. I caught him. We went down together. The wound was center mass, slightly left of spine. Entry wound, approximately 3 centimeters diameter. Exit wound, I did not need to assess the exit wound. The amount of blood communicated prognosis without examination. "Go," Shen said. Blood in his mouth. Lung damage. Breathing compromised. "Go. Go." Jace grabbed my shoulder. "We have to move. Now." I looked at Shen. He looked at me. In that moment, I had choice. Real choice. I could attempt to carry him. The perimeter was 200 meters distant. I was strong enough, possibly fast enough. We might make it, probably not, but possibly. Or I could leave him. I could run. I could survive. I could deliver the intelligence we had gathered. I could serve function over sentiment. Shen made the decision for me. He pushed my hands away from his body and said, "Report. Someone has to report." Then, very quietly, just for me, tell them the valley was real. I ran. Jace ran beside me. The perimeter guns opened fire, suppressing the orc pursuit. We crossed the threshold at full sprint. The gates sealed behind us. We had survived. I did not look back. This was not strength. This was cowardice. I could not watch Shen die. I could not witness the moment his bio signs ceased. I heard the gunfire behind us, PDF suppression fire and orc weapons responding. I heard the sounds for approximately 40 seconds. Then the pattern changed. Then the orc calls shifted from pursuit to discovery. Then I knew. I made my report to Lieutenant Harrow at 0647 hours. Day 416 post-contamination. I presented our documentation, our recordings, our technical assessments. I described the scale of the orc settlement, their manufacturing capacity, their numerical strength. I provided tactical recommendations that we both knew were irrelevant. I completed my function. Harrow listened without interruption. When I finished, he said, "Corporal Shen?" "Casualty," I said. "Recovered enemy fire, 230 meters from perimeter. Deceased." Harrow nodded. He did not offer condolences. Condolences were currency we had exhausted months ago. He simply logged the casualty and dismissed me to medical evaluation. I did not go to medical. I returned to the observation post I had shared with Shen. I sat in his chair. I looked at his notations on the data screens, his handwriting on the log sheets. The small marks that confirmed he had existed, had been present, had mattered. I understood then what I had done. I had chosen function over loyalty. I had chosen survival over witness. I had left him to die alone so that intelligence about orc manufacturing capabilities could be delivered 17 minutes faster than attempting rescue would have allowed. I had calculated the value of his life against the value of information and concluded information weighed more heavily. This was my complicity moment, not the act of leaving. That was arguably correct tactical decision. My complicity was the speed of my calculation, the ease of my choice, the lack of hesitation. I had been transformed so thoroughly by the system, by the grinding mathematics of survival, that I could abandon the only person who mattered without pause. I had become efficient. I had become functional. I had become the thing the Imperium required, a component that prioritized mission over humanity. Shen died at approximately 0649 hours on day 416. I was not present. I did not witness the moment. I cannot testify to his final experience. This absence is the weight I carry. This gap in the record is the punishment that continues. Week 63, Imperial relief forces arrived. Not the rescue we had prayed for, the conclusion we had expected. A cruiser-class vessel, accompanied by 2 escort frigates, they achieved orbit, performed reconnaissance sweeps, and transmitted their assessment to subsector command. Verdalis Prime was designated Lost Territory. Orc Infestation Terminal Stage, Ecosystem Transformation Irreversible. Recommended action, Exterminator's Protocol, Orbital Bombardment, Complete Sterilization. Lieutenant Harrow received the notification and gathered the remaining command staff. 112,000 survivors in the consolidation zone. No evacuation capacity, no transport ships. No alternatives. The Imperial Navy would bombard the planet in 72 hours. We could request priority targeting to ensure rapid casualties, minimize suffering, or we could wait and allow the bombardment to develop naturally. Command's choice. Harrow made no choice. He transmitted acknowledgement, dismissed his staff, and walked to the perimeter. He did not return. We found him outside the gates the next morning, dead from multiple orc blade wounds. He had gone alone, without weapon, without armor. He had chosen his ending rather than wait for fire from above. I understood his logic. I respected his decision. I did not follow his example. Week 64. Day 2. The bombardment began at 0600 hours. Lance strikes first, targeting the largest orc concentrations. The central settlement disappeared in thermal blooms visible from the consolidation zone. Then systematic bombardment of fungal mass concentrations, each strike calculated to maximize spore destruction, prevent regeneration. The planet shook. The atmosphere filled with particulate matter, ash, and vaporized biology, creating artificial twilight. The consolidation zone was struck at 13:47 hours. I was in the observation post, maintaining logs until the end, maintaining testimony. The lance strike vaporized the northern districts first. I felt the heat wave before the structure collapsed. I had perhaps 3 seconds of awareness, thermal bloom, pressure wave, the sensation of matter converting to energy. I should have died. Statistically, I did die. 112,000 souls in the consolidation zone. Estimated survival, 0. But statistics are not fate. They are probability, and probability occasionally allows aberrations. I regained consciousness in darkness, complete darkness, the kind that exists underground, away from all light sources. I was buried. Collapsed structure surrounding me, pressing down, but somehow not crushing. A pocket had formed. Geometry and fortune creating survival space where none should exist. I assessed my condition through systematic inventory. Left leg, crushed below knee, probably irreparable. Right arm, fractured, limited mobility. Respirator, damaged but functional. Water supply, none. Food, none. Probability of rescue, none. I existed in that darkness for a period I cannot accurately measure. My chronometer was destroyed. My sense of time degraded. I counted heartbeats initially, trying to maintain temporal awareness. But heartbeats blur into continuous rhythm, and rhythm becomes background process, and eventually I lost count. I hallucinated, not from injury, from isolation. The human mind requires input. Denied input, it generates its own. I saw Shen, not as he died, but as he had been during our night watches, sitting beside me holding my hand in darkness, bearing witness to my witness. I spoke to him. I told him about the bombardment, about the end of the world, about my survival that felt more like punishment than fortune. He did not respond. Hallucinations are monologues wearing another's face. I thought about the valley. I reconstructed it from memory with obsessive detail, walking through virtual fields that no longer existed on a world that was being sterilized from orbit. I calculated grain yield from our final harvest. I remembered my father's laugh. I heard my mother singing. I watched Davos working with methodical efficiency, every action economical, every movement purposeful. Then I lost those memories. Not forgot, lost. The details began degrading, fragments disappearing, faces blurring. I tried to hold them, tried to maintain archive integrity, but consciousness without external input corrupts its own data. The valley became impressionistic, then abstract, then simply the concept that a valley had existed. My family became names attached to emotional resonance, but no longer specific individuals. I realized in that darkness that this was the final death. The body dies quickly. The person dies gradually, but memory dies slowly, piece by piece, until nothing remains except the knowledge that something was lost without the ability to specify what. The excavation teams found me on day 17. 17 days buried alive, sustained by nothing except failing will and biological persistence. They were cleanup crews, processing rubble, searching for salvageable materials before final bombardment cycles. They found me by accident, responding to thermal signatures that indicated biological activity. They extracted me. They provided medical stabilization. They asked how I survived. I could not answer. Survival was not achievement. It was anomaly, statistical outlier. The one soul in 112,000 who happened to be in the correct 3 cubic meters when the lance strike hit. I was transported to the orbiting cruiser. I was processed through medical facilities that rebuilt my leg with augmetic components and stabilized my systemic damage. I was debriefed by naval intelligence, providing testimony about the Orc ecosystem development, the settlement construction, the transformation timeline. I delivered information clearly, precisely, without emotion. I had perfected that skill in darkness. The intelligence officer reviewing my debrief was a woman named Commander Vask. She listened to my complete testimony, reviewed the supporting documentation I had maintained until bombardment, and then asked a single question. Do you understand why we destroyed the world rather than attempt conventional military reclamation? I understood perfectly. I told her the mathematics. Orc population, 3 to 5 million specimens. Imperial force requirements for successful extermination. Estimated 2 to 3 million guard troops, sustained operations over 5 to 10 years, acceptable casualty rates in the 40 to 60% range. Cost, approximately 700 million thrones. Orbital bombardment cost, approximately 8 million thrones. The equation was simple. Paradise world status, revoked. Classification, expendable. Vask nodded. The Imperium makes these calculations constantly. Billions of worlds, trillions of souls, every decision balanced against resource allocation, strategic priority, acceptable loss. Verdalis Prime was beautiful. It was also replaceable. The mathematics were clear. She was correct. She was absolutely correct. I hated her for being correct. The bombardment continued for 6 weeks total. Complete sterilization protocol. Atmosphere conversion, crustal penetration, thermal treatment sufficient to eliminate all organic material to depth of 300 meters. When completed, Verdalis Prime was classified as dead world, potentially available for future colonization after 2-century minimum quarantine period to ensure complete spore elimination. I was reassigned to a data analysis position in Subsector Command. My experience with Orc ecosystem development made me valuable. I processed reports from other worlds experiencing similar contamination. I provided recommendation on bombardment timing, evacuation feasibility assessments, cost-benefit analysis for military intervention versus sterilization. I became efficient at calculating which worlds lived and which worlds died. I processed 7 similar situations in the first year, 13 in the second year, 20, 1 in the third. Each report followed similar patterns: spore fall, exponential growth, ecosystem transformation, orc emergence, the mathematics of when conventional response remained viable versus when bombardment became necessary. I calculated these equations without hesitation, without emotion. I had become very good at my function. Occasionally I read testimony from survivors, planetary governors pleading for more time, PDF commanders requesting reinforcement, civilians describing the loss of their homes, their families, their worlds. I read these testimonies and processed them as data points. Emotional content was irrelevant to calculation. Resource allocation equations did not include variables for human suffering. I met Trooper Callus during year 4 of my assignment. He was a new transfer to the Data Analysis Division, a former Guard infantryman reassigned after injuries rendered him unsuitable for combat deployment. He was young, 26, with burn scarring across his left side and a prosthetic eye that tracked with mechanical precision. He processed casualty reports and loss assessments with the thoroughness of someone who understood what the numbers represented. We worked adjacent positions for several months before speaking beyond professional necessity. Eventually, during a rest cycle, he asked about my previous assignment. I told him about Verdalis Prime. Brief summary, clinical details, no elaboration. He listened, then said, "You were there when it died." "Yes," I said. "Do you think about it?" I considered saying no, that processing the experience had archived it beyond regular access. But he had asked with genuine curiosity, not casual inquiry. He deserved accuracy. Every day, every report I process, every world I recommend for sterilization, I think about what I'm ending, who I'm killing. The valleys and fields and families that will cease existing because my calculations determined resource allocation didn't justify their preservation. Callus nodded slowly. Does it get easier? No, I said. It gets more efficient. I process faster, calculate quicker, file reports with greater speed. But easier? No. It compounds. Each world adds to the weight. I carry 41 worlds now. By end of this decade, I'll carry hundreds. The weight accumulates. Not closeness required vulnerability I had learned to suppress. But we worked together, occasionally shared meals, maintained proximity that produced isolation without creating dependency. He almost mattered, almost reached the significance Shen had possessed. But I had learned caution. I had learned that caring created leverage for loss. I kept Callus at distance, measured in emotional parsecs. Year 7, Callus died. Not dramatically. Augmetic failure, cascading system collapse, death in a medical facility surrounded by personnel who could not prevent mechanical failure from translating to biological termination. I was notified. I attended his corpse's processing. I filed the personnel loss report. I felt the absence like a distant echo of what Shen's loss had been. Diminished, processed, manageable. I realized then that I had successfully adapted. I had learned to continue without investment. I had become what the system required, a component that processed death without breaking, that calculated loss without stopping, that functioned eternally without requiring the inefficiency of emotional engagement. Year 12. I requested transfer to Verdalis Prime Archaeological Assessment Mission. The 2-century quarantine had been reduced to 15 years after advanced surveying confirmed complete biological sterilization. The administratum wanted preliminary evaluation for potential recolonization feasibility. I volunteered for the assessment team. Request approved. I returned to a world I did not recognize. The atmosphere had been reconstituted, breathable but sterile. The surface was glass in some regions, fused soil in others, vast stretches of nothing where paradise had existed. The valley where I had grown up was a crater now, geometry erased by lance strikes and thermal bombardment. I stood at the crater's edge and tried to remember what had been there. I could not. The memories had degraded too thoroughly during my 17 days in darkness. I knew a valley had existed. I could not reconstruct its details. The assessment team classified Verdalis Prime as suitable for recolonization after appropriate terraforming investment. Estimated timeline, 80 to 120 years. Estimated cost, 400 million thrones. Recommendation, proceed with preliminary development. In approximately 1 century, new colonists would arrive. They would build on sterilized Earth. They would never know what had existed before. They would create their own paradise, their own valleys, their own families, and perhaps in 3 or 4 centuries, orc spores would fall again, and the cycle would repeat. I am 53 years old now. I have served the administratum for 36 years. I have processed 217 worlds through contamination assessment protocols. 143 received sterilization recommendations. 74 received intervention allocation. My accuracy rating is 93%, calculated by comparing my recommendations to actual outcomes, measuring resource efficiency against strategic objectives. I am good at my function. I am efficient. I am reliable. I am exactly what the Imperium requires. I exist now as a component in the vast machinery of imperial administration. I process worlds through evaluation matrices. I calculate which civilizations live and which die. I perform this function without hesitation, without emotional interference, without the inefficiency of individual moral consideration. Occasionally, I access the archived memories of Shen. They are corrupted now, fragmented, incomplete. I remember his hands were thin, I remember he studied plants. I remember he held my hand in darkness and that contact mattered. The specifics have degraded. The face is indistinct. But the knowledge that he existed, that he mattered, that his absence created weight, that persists. I think about the choice I made at 230 meters from the perimeter. Run or stay. Abandon or attempt rescue. Function or loyalty. I made the correct tactical decision. I delivered intelligence that informed subsequent Imperial response protocols. My survival has enabled the processing of 217 additional worlds. The mathematics justify my choice. But mathematics are not morality. Efficiency is not righteousness. And survival achieved through abandonment carries cost that compounds annually. I am a witness who became a calculator. I observed paradise transforming into war garden, watched ecosystems being overwritten, documented the brutal efficiency of orc biological warfare. Then I became part of the system that processes such observations into resource allocation decisions. I perpetuate the machinery that consumed my world by helping it consume others more efficiently. The Imperium functions through such transformations. It converts witnesses into components, survivors into calculators, victims into instruments. It does not do this through cruelty. Cruelty requires intention. It does this through necessity, through scale, through the mathematics of managing 1,000,000 worlds against infinite threats. I understand this. I accept this. I continue this. I think about Shen sometimes, during rest cycles when processing efficiency is not required. I think about the valley, though I can no longer visualize its details. I think about my family, though their faces have become abstract concepts rather than specific features. I think about the 143 worlds I have recommended for sterilization, the billions of souls erased because my calculations determined they were not strategically valuable. I carry this weight. I process it as background data, present, but not interfering with function. I have learned to exist with permanent grief, permanent complicity, permanent knowledge that I am both victim and instrument of the system that destroyed everything I valued. This is my testimony. I was Matthias Kellen, second son of a grain cultivation family on the Dallas Prime. I watched orc spores fall like snow. I witnessed paradise transformed into war garden in less than 2 years. I abandoned the only person who mattered to preserve myself and my function. I survived when 112,000 did not. I became a calculator who determines which worlds live and which die. I exist now in service to the Imperium. I process data. I file reports. I calculate efficiently. I function without breaking. The valley was real. Shen was real. The world I lost was real. I remember this, even as the details corrupt. I testify to this, even knowing testimony changes nothing. Someone should remember what paradise looked like before it became a garden for war. I remember. Imperfectly. Incompletely. But I remember. That is all that remains.